Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the second event in MIRA's four-part speaker series, Impact for Dollars Through State Budget Advocacy. My name is Eva Malona. I'm the President and CEO of the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, MIRA. MIRA is the largest immigrant advocacy organization in New England, promoting and enhancing immigrant and refugee rights and immigrant and refugee integration. MIRA state budget advocacy efforts are some of our most impactful work. With our member organizations and our partners, both in and outside the state legislature, we are able to ensure robust investment in immigrant and refugee communities, providing critical resources for their inclusion, advancement, well-being, and protecting those often left out. As you will hear today, we have several recent successes in securing millions of dollars to fund priorities such as food and rental assistance program, domestic violence services, employment services, and more. Today, Amy Grander, MIRA's Director of Legislative Affairs, and Hema Sarang-Sermitsky, Director of Policy at Jane Doe, will discuss the process of working with legislators to ensure that our priorities are met. We encourage you to participate by posing questions in the chat box, and we will address them at the end. I want to thank you again for your presence, for your interest, and for your support of MIRA. And now it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Amy Grander, to lead us through this discussion. Amy, please take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for making time to attend today's event. And thanks especially to Hema for joining us and to Jane Doe, Inc., our partner in budget advocacy. My name is Amy Grunder, she, series pronouns. I direct MIRA's state-level advocacy, which includes advocacy on specific bills and the state budget, which is our topic today. You're probably most familiar with our big public-focused, multi-year legislative campaigns for bills like the Safe Communities Act or the Work and Family Mobility Act, both pending before the state legislature as we speak. Both bills advanced out of committee this year, by the way, a first for both campaigns. And we're a coalition leader in the campaign for Safe Communities, which would end state and local involvement in deportations, and with it, the corrosive fear that this costly involvement creates in immigrant communities. We also play a leadership role in the Driving Families Forward Coalition, which advocates for the Work and Family Mobility Act, a bill that would extend driver's licenses to all qualified drivers, regardless of immigration status. We're also the organization that laid the groundwork for this bill back in 2016 when Real ID licenses were introduced. So my work includes building support in the State House and working with our organizing team and coalition members to build public support on the ground. This means that I have kind of one foot in the State House and the other foot in coalition work, and I kind of serve as a conduit of information from one community to the other. But when you support MIRA and Jane Doe, you're also supporting critical work that we do every year to ensure funding for state programs and services for immigrant and refugee families in our state. The dollars that you give us have a multiplier effect, translating into millions of dollars of funding for these communities. The state budget is particularly important for immigrant families. With all the congressional gridlock at the federal level, states have a really key role in ensuring the inclusion of immigrants in our economy and in our civic life. For the last 4 years especially, all of the action has been at the state level. MIRA is the only organization in the state with a dedicated state house presence devoted solely to representing the interests and needs of our immigrant and refugee communities. Our advocacy is both informed by our members and advanced in collaboration with our members and our allies. So today's event is particularly timely because state budget deliberations are happening as we speak. The House passed a $46 billion budget last week, and the Senate is debating and will pass theirs this week. In a normal year, this occurs in April and May, respectively. But as you know, there's nothing normal about this year. So here we are, 6 months into the new fiscal year, with the goal of a final budget by Thanksgiving. There are also supplementary budgets voted throughout the year to address unforeseen expenses that allow more opportunities for our advocacy. So in particular, MIRA's budget advocacy ensures a growing state investment in immigrant and refugee communities year after year. Every year we advocate for priority line items like, for example, English classes for adult immigrants. You may not know that about 9% of state residents are what we call limited English proficient. Waiting lists for these classes hover at about 20,000 people. Always greater need than availability. Citizenship programs that help people negotiate and succeed in the long application process for citizenship. Of course, this supports building the immigrant vote, also very important for building power in immigrant communities. Employment support programs that benefit linguistic minorities within the immigrant population. And then finally, funding for outreach and services for immigrant survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, which you'll hear more about from our speaker joining me today, Hema Sorensen-Insky, representing Jane Doe, Inc. For each of these line items, we and our partners work together, supporting and amplifying each other's advocacy at the State House and mobilizing our members to engage with their legislators. So I'd like to say that these line items that I've just mentioned alone account for in this year's budget, account for $95 million. That's in the budget under consideration this week. I'm happy to report that we got all the funding that we asked for in the House budget and then some, and we're optimistic that we'll get the same in this week's Senate budget. And I'd also want to emphasize that in the COVID-19 era, especially, the work of MIRA and our partners and our State House allies has been really critical to ensuring that COVID-19 relief funds benefit our hardest hit communities, not only immigrant communities, but certainly, especially immigrant communities. This includes direct cash assistance provided through a network of community organizations, partnered with regional foundations, and also rental assistance to prevent evictions and homelessness. This kind of funding, again, benefits everyone, but as we know, immigrant communities have suffered disproportionately both from infection rates and also and joblessness, and also have less access to safety net programs. And on that note, I'd like to add that earlier this year in the summer, MIRA conducted a community survey of 433 households from among our member organizations, and that revealed that nearly 60% of the households that were reported food insecurity. And for households with undocumented members, it was 77.8%. And 3 out of 5 of those households faced housing insecurity as well. So these kinds of budget wins are critically important and for the immigrant community. And we've been working really hard all spring and summer and into the fall on all of this. And the other piece is that in all of these budget wins, our credibility and our connection with state lawmakers has really played a critical role. We're especially grateful to House and Senate leadership and also to the governor and First Lady for their inclusive response to this pandemic. Another aspect of the work that we do is we play an important role in defense. So that's like budget defense, defending against harmful budget amendments. Unlike other bills, the state budget has to pass every year. So it's very common for legislators to kind of tack on non-budget legislation like a rider to ensure that it goes through and gets passed. So a great example of that is the Roe Act. That was filed as an independent bill, but then approved as an outside section to the House budget passed last week. That's a perfect example. But each year we work with our legislative allies to defeat harmful amendments that are tacked on in exactly this way. And these are amendments that seek to exclude immigrants from the limited programs and protections that they're eligible for. We're kind of the go-to organization for these legislators who rely on us every year to flag these items and their impact on immigrant communities. So just a couple examples. Every year we see proposals to limit access to in-state tuition rates at public, limiting them to just citizens and green card holders, or limit access to housing assistance, or to punish municipalities that decide not to participate in federal immigration enforcement, or and the like. Limit access to, and I add that this kind of work with legislators is both really gratifying and really fruitful. I had a call from a senator today who was asking about the impact of specific language in an amendment that she was considering filing in the Senate debate that's occurring right now. because so many things touch immigration, almost every area of policy, immigrants are implicated. And so it's often, it takes a lot of thought to figure out what that impact is going to be. And we're not the only ones. Obviously, legislators rely on other advocates for other kinds of questions as well. But this is a really important role that advocates play. We've also introduced positive budget amendments. Some of you might remember that in 2018, we worked with Senate allies to pass key provisions of the Safe Communities Act as an amendment to the Senate budget. And that was the first time, to our knowledge, that any chamber passed legislation that included undocumented immigrants as beneficiaries. So budget advocacy produces both dollars and policy that serve our immigrant communities. So when you support coalitions like MIRA and JDI, or Jane Doe, your investment is magnified many times and results in concrete wins and protections for our communities year after year. And of course, we couldn't do any of this work without the help of our member and allied organizations. So this is a good time to introduce one of our key allies in these endeavors, and that's Hema Sarang-Saminsky, who's policy director of Jane Doe, Inc., the Massachusetts Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. And then we'll take questions. Take it away, Hema.
Thank you so much, Amy. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. Just such deep gratitude to MIRA and all of your advocacy. This partnership is so meaningful to us, and partnerships make our work easier and stronger. And really grateful to all of you. Just want to talk a bit about Jane Doe, our state coalition to end sexual and domestic violence. And JDI represents 59 member programs. We're up to 59 now, and all of whom work to end sexual and domestic violence across the Commonwealth through prevention and education programs and through so many forms of direct advocacy with survivors, which is particularly important in the current public health crisis that we are in. I'm going to talk a bit about that. We also advocate for policy and systems change on a number of fronts and have as our priority areas sexual and domestic violence prevention and education, racial equity work, economic justice, and human rights. And we really see our policy work on behalf of survivors as sort of needing to sit at the intersections of the range of issues that can impact the most vulnerable survivors and communities amongst us. So I wanted to talk a bit about sexual and domestic violence and its intersections with immigration and the experience specifically of immigrant survivors. We know, I think we've heard that sexual and domestic violence cuts across all demographics, and really just wanted to highlight for all of you that at the core of both sexual and domestic violence is really power and control. It's the power that one person or an individual exerts over someone else. And for immigrant survivors of sexual and domestic violence, this harm is made so much worse by the dynamics that tell the survivor that they won't be believed because of their status, that they can't seek help because of their status. This is so common. And in my background as an immigration attorney for a number of years with survivors, I heard this all of the time from individuals who'd be seeking relief through the immigration laws that existed, that they felt that they were unable to access support or safety because the person who harmed them convinced them that they would not be believed if they spoke up, whether they spoke to a family member or to authorities, that they would not be believed. And I guess today I just want to highlight that this is not only an interpersonal dynamic, it's also a systemic one. We live, unfortunately, in a society that often says that immigrant voices and experiences don't matter. And for immigrant survivors of sexual and domestic violence, this leads to some pretty dire consequences. It can lead to silence and further harm. So I just want to uplift two policy issues that we work certainly closely with MIRA on, and really appreciate any opportunity to uplift the importance of safe communities, which is really one concrete way to mitigate the immense fear that so many survivors experience each time they try to reach out for help. And also driver's license access. Mobility is key to a survivor's safety and agency. So having something when a survivor has their agency taken away, the opportunity to be able to move freely, to access safety and support without fear that they will be stopped or prevented from accessing those services because of their status is so critical. You know, I think I want to highlight today that there is, despite these barriers and fears that so many survivors, there is help available. And I just want to take a minute to talk a bit about what our member programs are doing right now. There are programs across the Commonwealth that support survivors regardless of where they're at in their healing journey. There's no requirement that you reach out to law enforcement if that's not something that you feel is appropriate for you, or that you even need to know what outcome you want, right? There are advocates who are really on the front lines providing support with housing, legal assistance, medical advocacy, culturally and linguistically specific services, and so much more. And so many programs who really have the expertise in the unique needs of immigrant survivors specifically. You know, when we were thinking about our budget advocacy for at this current moment, you know, we really listened to our member programs who shared with us that, you know, 84% of member programs that were surveyed experienced an increase in requests for services between FY18 and 19. And 63% of those programs were not able to meet those needs that increased demand for services. So as we know, less access to services, increased risk of harm. And, you know, that's really why we're asking our legislature to increase funding for sexual and domestic violence services by an additional $5.38 million. This gives programs the opportunity to expand their advocacy, their legal advocacy, their housing related advocacy, medical advocacy, support for immigrant survivors in culturally and linguistically specific ways. It allows increased access to help and safety, which is, you know, honestly important. The need for that has only escalated due to COVID. I want to just talk a little bit about what investing in local community-based programs looks like, and why it's so critical that we increase that support right now. You know, while many folks think about domestic and sexual violence services as, you know, either hotlines or shelter, there's so much more to that. Those are huge services that our programs offer, but it's really that wraparound of, you know, supporting survivors and the communities in which they live with issues of food insecurity, housing, legal needs, and so much more every day. We're so pleased to see that the Senate budget has prioritized the needs of sexual and domestic violence survivors and really honored the wisdom of local programs, and just truly want to advocate and lift up the work of advocates every day. I mean, advocates make this work possible, and without them, you know, the Commonwealth would be in a tough place, and we really want to just celebrate and lift up their work. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Hema. And I just want to say to everyone here, I value, you know, and I know my organization does, our partnership with you so much. We've worked together on a lot of issues, and it's we stay in touch about the different issues that we're working on and see how we can help and magnify each other's advocacy. And we're so grateful for all of you and all of your great work with immigrant survivors and all the organizations you work with too and support in your coalition, who we also have the pleasure of working with. So thank you. And I think what we want to do now is, I think we're opening for questions, right? And those would be questions for Hema or for myself. And I think they're going to be dropped into the chat. So we'll wait for those for a minute. Oh, we've got one already. Okay. The first question, I think we've started to answer. One question is, how does being part of a coalition, including your own coalition, so the MIRA coalition or Jane Doe's coalition, make a difference in your advocacy? And I think you started to say something about that. Is there anything you want to add to that, Hema?
Yeah, we are a policy team of three of us, including our executive director. And, you know, I love coalitions. I love coalition work. I've always been drawn to it. And the relationships that we create and build with one another really are key to identifying, what gaps in systems there are and how we can work collectively to solve these issues, right? It is impossible to, when we think about our work to end sexual and domestic violence, we really try to keep our vision of that work as broad as possible. And, it would be a mistake for us to look too narrowly as to what those issues are. And without our coalition partners like MIRA, like the Row Coalition, like the Healthy Youth Coalition, all of those relationships really help us sit at tables with the experts on the range of ways in which our systems can be improved for all survivors of sexual and domestic violence. So that's a huge. It's a pleasure to be able to sit in those spaces with you and everybody we work with.
I echo those sentiments exactly. For example, we are also a small staff. All of us have small staffs, small advocacy staffs, and we can't do the work ourselves. We absolutely rely on partnerships with other organizations, and they look to us for leadership on a lot of these issues, right? But we, in turn, at MIRA, look for leadership to our most impacted community members who are represented by their own organizations. There's no way that we can advocate to really understand how to go about our advocacy and put together a bill like the Safe Communities Act without having input from the immigrant communities that are impacted by this. So I would agree with everything that you just said, Hema. And I see other questions here. This question says, this is a question that says, can you talk more about how the pandemic, this is for you, Hema, I think, can you talk more about how the pandemic affected domestic violence issues? And again, I think you said something. Is there anything you would add to that? Oh, but particularly for immigrant communities, once again.
Yeah, I mean, I think, COVID, the pandemic has, of course, impacted all of us. And I think for immigrant survivors, it really magnified the level of silence and isolation that would have already existed pre-pandemic. So, services with the stay-at-home orders, with lack of mobility, with economic insecurity, with the housing crisis and fear of losing one's home, that additional experience of being a survivor of sexual and domestic violence or domestic violence really, heightened the level of harm that many survivors are experiencing. We hear that there's an escalation of some of the most basic needs that many survivors are expressing in terms of the need for food, medical care, and housing has escalated. Fears of accessing medical care have also escalated, as was certainly true pre-pandemic, but has only increased now due to all of the systemic barriers that exist. Many survivors are facing potential eviction or, illegal evictions that are happening by landlords who, use their power to either keep immigrant survivors in silence. So many ways that this pandemic has only exacerbated problems that existed prior. I think, one suggestion that, I think this is a time to pull in our kind of community supports that we can lean on. There's a lot of conversation about mutual aid. And, we at Jane Doe, we really initially talked about, changing the conversation from social distancing to physical distancing, but social connection. And I think that was really in the spirit of, let's remember to check in on those around us and, do our best to take care of our neighbors and community members that might be most impacted by this pandemic right now, and especially and including immigrant survivors.
Great, thank you. Another question, is partisan gridlock as present at the state level as it is on the federal level? That's a really interesting question. I wouldn't call it, I don't know if I would call it gridlock. I'll take a first stab at this, and I'd love to hear your perspective, Hema. So the problem at the federal level is it's very partisan, right? The gridlock is partisan. Democrats are on one side of an issue and Republicans are on the other. We don't have that problem at the State House because our State House is overwhelmingly Democratic, right? So we have 160 House members, only 30 of whom are Republicans. And then on the Senate, now we only have 3 Republican senators and 37 Democrats. So there isn't partisan gridlock at all at the State House. There is some, anyone who's following the news about the State House notices that there are occasionally reports of tension between those two bodies. And I think a lot of that has to do with control, right? Because unlike other states, in Massachusetts, with regard to legislation, in Massachusetts, bills, once they get filed, they get assigned to a committee. And then they have to leave that committee in order to get acted on or brought to the floor. And so in Massachusetts, we have joint committees. And so what that means is there are Senate members and House members. But because the House is a majority in the whole state legislature, it's also majority on those joint committees, whereas other states will have a Senate committee and a House committee, and they can act on their own. In our state, they have to vote as a body. And so because there's less senators, they're always outvoted. So the House gets effective control over what bills get moved forward. And then the other issue I would say is, I guess the other thing I would say is just that I think the Senate and the House have different styles of working. I think House very much, well, they probably both do this to some extent, but the House looks for consensus before they look for agreement before they'll bring a bill to the floor for a vote. And we have a very diverse legislature and an incredibly politically diverse state. You wouldn't know it living in Greater Boston, right? But as I do. But it's hard to get everybody on board, particularly with an issue that's considered controversial, which would not be domestic violence, but it is immigration. So where those two intersect. Anyway. So I'm looking for other questions. Somebody said that they had audio problems. This is from Susan Potter, a reporter from CNS. She said that she missed the first 8 minutes due to, oh, that's a lot, due to audio problems. So in the beginning, so what you basically missed was me kind of laying out the work that we do on the state budget. We have a number of line items that we support every year. That fund programs that benefit immigrants, refugees, and also a lot of other people. They're not all specific to immigrants and refugees. It's really critical work. The House passed a $46 billion budget last week, and the Senate's working on a similar budget now. And generally we've always supported, we have priority line items like English classes for adult immigrants, citizenship programs, funding to support employment support programs that benefit linguistic minorities in the immigrant population, and then funding for outreach and services for immigrant survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, which we were just hearing about. And these items alone amount to about $95 million. And then we talked a little bit about our work during the COVID-19 crisis and how we were able to ensure that the response of state lawmakers to the crisis was inclusive of our most impacted communities, which of course are immigrant communities who suffer overwhelmingly from the same things that are happening to everyone else. But then on top of it, they have higher infection rates. They work in essential industries. They live on top of each other, so that there's more spread because of that. And then on top of it, they have very little access to safety net programs. So they are a community that absolutely needed help, and they were getting help. They've been getting help from the state. So that's really helpful. I think that's all I would say there. And then other questions. All right. I'm wondering, I see another question about, so here's a question from someone that says, if organizations like Jane Doe or smaller organizations did not have state funding, what would this mean for them and their ability to benefit immigrants across the state? So I'm not sure, like, we don't get state funding. I don't know if Jane Doe does.
You know,
I mean, we got funding for when we ran the complete count committee for the state, but we don't regularly get state funding.
You know, I think the way we think about this is sort of the importance of our Commonwealth needs to be investing in services and support for sexual and domestic violence survivors to support all of our member programs. And I'm not sure if that's what the question is getting to, but in addition, I mean, of course, our member programs receive a range of other forms of federal funding, private funding, et cetera. But the state investment is what is so critical to really uplift the unique needs of, from Western Mass to here to Greater Boston, the range of unique needs of survivors. So we really want to uplift the critical needs to invest in local support.
Okay, I just got a clarification on that question. I think it was referring to when we talked about the cash assistance that went to the most impacted households and populations in the state. That aid was distributed through community-based organizations working on the ground, right? And it was provided first to community foundations. The Boston Resiliency Fund is a good model for this too. And also even the private fund, the governor launched a private fund that does this as well, the COVID-19 Relief Fund. These regional organizations provide funds, or regional foundations provide funds to the grassroots organizations, which are most closely connected to their communities and able to identify the most pressing needs. And so I think that then the question was, what would it mean if these organizations didn't have access to this funding? And it is it was quite impressive. I think some of you saw the coverage of one organization, that Chelsea Collaborative in Chelsea, Massachusetts, and that thousands of families they were feeding every week that was completely dependent on getting funds. They couldn't have done it themselves. Most of this funding was, I believe, private philanthropy, but this kind of without these organizations, our immigrant communities would have had nothing. They would have access to nothing because there's very little access to state or federal assistance if you're an immigrant. And then I am reminded also that we did get, actually, I didn't think of it this way, but we do get, so MIRA specifically does get some state funding in answer to the earlier question, even though that wasn't, I don't think what you were getting at, but we do get funding for citizenship programs, our citizenship clinics and all of that. So I forgot to mention that. All right, what else do we have here? I think then someone asked, do legislators, this is a great question actually, do legislators consider immigrants and foreign-born part of their constituency, right? And of course they are a part of their constituent. You are someone's constituent regardless of your immigration status. If you live here, you are a constituent, but I don't think all legislators realize that. We did hear a story of one legislator who was in a community forum with a group, a large number of immigrant members of the immigrant community, and she was asked to support a specific piece of legislation, and she said, "I have to go ask my constituents first." And of course, they were her constituents, so that was troubling. But I think that situation is getting better. Actually, I have to say, I really do. Yeah. What do you think?
And I'd have to say that, I mean, I think the extent to which our legislature really has really deepened their understanding on the unique needs of sexual and domestic violence survivors generally, but specifically immigrant survivors. I think that has really come a long way in the past several years. And, we have some real champions in both the House and the Senate who deeply understand and actually want to look at that intersection of immigrant survivor experience as a lens through which to think about policy and legislative change. So in that sense, I feel like there is some, real movement there. And, for those who are less inclined to see those intersections, I think being able to convey the experiences of immigrant survivors and actually goes a long way to helping kind of move that conversation forward and help them understand, that immigrant survivors are very much their constituents. So, yeah, seen some good progress.
I think also that immigrants have just become a more visible constituency over the last 4 years for obvious reasons. And with that, I'll go and segue into the next question, which is, will the incoming Biden administration impact your work at the state level on immigrant issues? And this is a great question. I'm so glad that it was asked, because we're already hearing from state legislators that, okay, we don't have to do any of this stuff now, Safe Communities Act, driver's license bill, because the Biden administration is not the Trump administration. It's everything's going to change. And what I always like to point out to people, first of all, I should acknowledge that immigrants became more visible in the public mind because of the attacks on them over the last 4 years. But then also, I would say that under the Biden administration, many of the policies, I expect obviously he'll dial back on all these harmful regulations and rules and policies and practices and, family separation at the border, all of that stuff will disappear. I think we can be certain of that. But for things like the Safe Communities Act, those policies that bill would end, those policies were enforced during Democratic as well as Republican administration. In fact, they reached their height under the Obama administration and caused a lot of damage to immigrant community confidence in police and healthcare workers and just about any other sort of representation of a public authority. So that problem we don't expect to go away without state action. And obviously the driver's license bill, that's a state issue. So that's not. I think maybe it's time to wrap up. I know we said we were going to wrap up around, I think, 1:35. So I guess I'd like to thank everyone for attending and for taking the time to listen and learn more about this work. And I especially want to thank HEMA for joining us today, and Jane Doe for being the organization that you are, the partner, the ally, and for looking out for the most vulnerable members of the immigrant community, in my view. We're honored to work with you. As we mentioned earlier, for the general audience, this is the second event in a 4-part series, and we hope you'll join us again in 2 weeks for a discussion on our citizenship programs. So thanks again, everyone, for joining, and we hope to see you next week as well. Thank you.